Have you ever heard a story so impossible it makes you question the laws of life and death? Tonight, we're diving into one of Alabama's most disturbing mysteries, the slave baby that shouldn't have lived, and the cry that brought death. This story from 1861 isn't just folklore. It's pieced together from rare plantation records, diaries and forgotten archives that took weeks to uncover. So before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? And if you love true historical mysteries built on real documented evidence, hit that subscribe button right now, because every story here is backed by truth, no matter how dark it gets. It began on a cold, stormless night in 1861, deep in the heart of Alabama, when a child was born that should never have drawn breath. The plantation was quiet, except for the moans of labor coming from a small cabin tucked behind the fields, where a young enslaved woman named Eliza lay in the throes of agony. The other women surrounded her, whispering prayers under their breath, for the birth had gone on far too long. Sweat poured down her face, her hands clawing at the sheets, her body trembling with exhaustion and fear. The midwife, an older woman known as Aunt Cora, had delivered hundreds of children, but she knew something was wrong. The air felt heavy, almost electric, and the candlelight flickered though there was no wind. Hours passed before the baby finally came, small, pale, and utterly still. There was no cry, no movement. Eliza stared at the motionless body, her eyes glassy and vacant. Ancora tried everything she knew, warm cloth, firm slaps, whispered prayers, but the child never stirred. After nearly an hour, she declared the baby stillborn. The women wrapped it gently in linen and set it aside. Eliza's wails echoed into the night, soft at first, and then breaking into something that barely sounded human. When she finally passed out from exhaustion, Aunt Cora placed the still bundle by the window and told the others they'd bury it come sunrise. That should have been the end of it. But the night wasn't done. Near midnight, one of the younger women tending the fire swore she heard a sound, faint, almost like wind through the cracks. She turned, listening, and the sound came again, sharper this time. It wasn't wind. It was a cry, weak, rasping, but unmistakable. Every woman in the room froze. Slowly, Aunt Cora approached the window where the linen bundle lay. The cloth trembled. She peeled it back, and what she saw made her drop to her knees. The baby, pale as moonlight and slick with cold sweat, had opened its mouth and let out another fragile wail. Its eyes were open now, not dark brown like its mother's, but a cloudy gray, glassy and unblinking. No one spoke for a long moment. Then Aunt Cora whispered, "It's not right. It's not supposed to be breathing." Panic spread among them. They called for Eliza, who awoke screaming when she saw her child alive. She grabbed the baby to her chest, weeping, kissing its head again and again. The others begged her to let Aunt Cora examine it, but she wouldn't listen. The midwife, shaken to her core, stood back, muttering that the line between life and death had been crossed, and no good would come of it. By dawn, word had spread across the quarters that a dead baby had come back to life. The enslaved workers kept their distance, crossing themselves, whispering old words in tongues the masters never understood. Even the overseer refused to come near the cabin. When the news reached the big house, Judge Abram Varnu demanded to see the child himself. He marched down to the quarters with his wife and a physician from town. The doctor examined the infant, pale and trembling, and declared that perhaps the child had only appeared stillborn, that sometimes a weak pulse could fool the senses. But even as he spoke, there was unease in his eyes. The baby's skin felt unnaturally cold, its heartbeat faint but erratic. And those eyes, those strange grey eyes, followed no one, focusing on nothing. Eleanor Varnu, the judge's wife, insisted the child be baptized immediately, fearing some unholy thing had taken place. But Eliza refused to hand the baby over. She clung to it, whispering lullabies that sounded more like prayers, refusing to let anyone touch her son. That night, as the plantation settled into silence, a series of odd things began to happen. The dogs barked relentlessly at the tree line, refusing to stop even when beaten. Chickens were found dead in the morning, their necks broken but untouched by predators. The wind seemed to hum through the trees, though the air was still, and from Eliza's cabin faint cries could be heard, not the cries of a newborn, but something deeper, slower, like the echo of something far older. And Cora said it sounded like the earth mourning. As the days passed, the child's condition grew stranger. He rarely cried, but would stare into corners, as if watching invisible figures move. His skin remained cold, no matter how close he was held to the fire. The other slaves refused to enter Eliza's cabin, saying they could feel something in the air, a pressure that made their chests ache and their heads spin. When one woman tried to bless the baby with holy water, she fainted on the spot and woke with a fever that lasted 3 days. The overseer, furious at the fear spreading through the quarters, tried to take the child away by force. Before he could reach the door, a heavy beam from the ceiling came loose and struck him across the shoulder, shattering his arm. After that, no one tried again. Judge Varnu ordered that the baby be taken to the main house for proper care, but when his men went to fetch it, they found Eliza gone. She had vanished into the swamp beyond the fields, carrying her child with her. For 3 days no one saw her. On the 4th day, she emerged from the trees barefoot, covered in mud, clutching the infant to her chest. She said she had followed a voice in the dark that told her to bring the child back before it woke something worse. When she returned, the baby was silent again, its eyes open but lifeless. Everyone believed it was dead for the 2nd time, but late that night the crying started once more. Only this time it wasn't just in the cabin. The sound came from the fields, from the trees, from the very walls of the big house. The slaves refused to leave their quarters. The judge locked himself inside his study, and even Eleanor claimed to hear the wail echoing from the nursery upstairs, a nursery that had never held a child. By morning, a servant was found dead near the barn, his face twisted in terror, his mouth open as if he'd been screaming. And when Aunt Cora went to check on Eliza, she found the mother sitting perfectly still, eyes fixed on the baby that shouldn't have lived, whispering again and again, "He just wants to be heard." The morning after the baby's 2nd cry, the plantation was no longer a place of work or life. It had become a place of whispers. Every corner of the land, from the slave quarters to the big house itself, was filled with uneasy glances and hushed tones. No one dared to speak of it openly, yet everyone knew. The child who had been declared dead had returned to life, and that was something nature itself seemed to reject. Among the enslaved, old stories began to rise again. Stories their ancestors had whispered across the ocean, stories of spirits that borrowed the faces of the dead and of cries that beckoned the unseen. They said that when a stillborn breathes again, it's not a gift, but a warning, that death had been cheated, and it always demands payment. Eliza became the center of their fear and pity. She wandered the quarters with the infant in her arms, humming strange lullabies that no one recognized. The songs sounded like words in reverse, slow and mournful, as if she were singing not to soothe the baby, but to keep something else asleep. The women who once cared for her kept their distance. When Aunt Cora tried to speak with her, Eliza only smiled faintly and said, "He remembers them all, every soul that touched him." Those words unsettled the old midwife more than she cared to admit. By the next day, she had quietly packed her things and gone to another plantation miles away, swearing she would never set foot on that cursed ground again. But the fear didn't stop with the slaves. Even the white folk of the plantation felt it in their bones. The overseer refused to patrol the quarters at night, claiming he heard a baby crying from the woods long after Eliza and her child were asleep. When he followed the sound once, it led him to the riverbank, where he saw tiny footprints pressed in the mud, moving toward the water, but never coming back. The judge dismissed his fears as drunken nonsense. Yet that night, when he went out to his study, he too heard something. A faint cry carried on the wind, echoing down the chimney. It wasn't loud, but it pierced the air like a needle. When he followed the sound, it stopped abruptly, leaving the house wrapped in an unnatural silence that felt heavier than the noise itself. Rumors began to spread through the neighboring plantations. They said the Varnu estate was under a curse, that the dead were restless there. Field hands whispered that the child was born with two souls, one of this world and one from the grave. Some even claimed to have seen it themselves, swaddled in Eliza's arms at dusk, its eyes open and glowing faintly in the dark. Others swore they saw nothing but shadows moving behind her when she walked past the fields. And then there was the sound, the cry that came not from the baby, but from the air around them. It started as a faint hum, then turned into a shrill wail that rose from the ground itself, a cry that made the animals restless and the air thick with dread. Eleanor Varnu tried to restore order by bringing in a preacher. She believed the strange happenings were the work of witchcraft, and demanded that every slave be blessed and every cabin cleansed. The preacher arrived one morning, a tall man with a trembling hand clutching his Bible. He prayed in every room, sprinkled holy water, and recited verses in a trembling voice. When he reached Eliza's cabin, the child began to cry again. It was not the cry of hunger or pain. It was long, low, and piercing, echoing with a depth that no human throat could produce. The preacher froze. His Bible slipped from his hand and fell open on the floor. Without a word, he left the room, walked straight to his horse, and rode away without looking back. That evening, the well water turned dark, and the cows refused to give milk. The slaves began to say that the baby's cry wasn't just a sound, it was a summons. Some said it called to the spirits of the dead, those who had suffered on that land for generations. Others believed it called for something older, something that had slept beneath the earth long before the plantation was built. No one could sleep peacefully anymore. At night, the air seemed alive with whispers, soft, indistinct murmurs that drifted through the quarters like smoke. Sometimes they would rise into a cry, faint but sharp, and every time it came something died. A chicken, a horse, a man's spirit. The pattern was too precise to be ignored. Judge Varnu refused to believe the talk of curses. He called the slaves ignorant, claiming their fear was the root of the unrest. Yet even he could not explain what happened one evening when he entered the nursery that his wife had prepared years ago for the child they never had. Inside, he found the cradle rocking slowly, though no wind stirred the curtains. A faint cooing filled the room. When he turned to leave, the cradle stopped, and from within came a soft laugh like a baby's, but deeper, distorted, hollow. The judge ordered the nursery locked and never entered it again. Eleanor grew pale and withdrawn. She said she could feel the baby's presence in her dreams, standing by her bed, watching her with those glassy grey eyes. She would wake in tears, clutching her chest, whispering that she could still hear its cry inside her ears. Once she tried to give Eliza a silver cross, begging her to lay it near the baby's crib. Eliza only shook her head and said softly, "He doesn't like the sound of metal. It burns his name." After that, Eleanor refused to go near her again. The line between slave and master began to blur in those days because fear ruled everyone equally. When the cry came at night, no one moved, no one breathed. The dogs would cower under the porch, and even the wind seemed to die. And always the sound carried the same terrible rhythm, a long wail followed by silence, then a shorter cry, almost like an echo, as if something else were answering from far away. By then, everyone knew what it meant. Someone on the plantation would not live to see morning. The whispers grew into terror. People began to say the baby wasn't a child at all, but a messenger, a voice borrowed by something that wanted to remind them of every sin buried on that land. The overseer finally fled one night after seeing Eliza walking through the fields with the infant, though the moonlight passed straight through its body. After that, no one doubted the stories. The cry that had once belonged to a miracle now belonged to death itself. And still, Eliza rocked her child, singing her strange reversed lullabies, as if she knew that every note she hummed was the only thing keeping the world from hearing what that cry truly meant. The first death came quietly, almost unnoticed, but it was only the beginning of something that would soon consume everyone connected to the Varnu plantation. 3 days after the baby's second cry echoed through the fields, one of the young field hands, Samuel, was found lifeless near the river. There were no wounds on him, no signs of struggle, only a look of frozen terror on his face and blood trickling from his ears. The judge ordered his burial without ceremony, saying it was fever or exhaustion, but the others knew better. They whispered that Samuel had been one of the few who mocked the baby, calling it the devil's breath. That same night he died. People claimed they heard faint crying near the riverbank, though the cabin where Eliza and the infant slept was on the other side of the property. After that, death seemed to move like a fog, slow, creeping, inevitable. The next to go was Aunt Liddy, an old woman who had helped deliver the baby. She began to complain of hearing a sound at night, a low, muffled sobbing outside her window that would not stop. She said it was calling her name, soft and broken, like a baby trying to form words. The others told her to pray, to cover her ears, but 3 nights later she was found slumped over her chair, eyes wide open, mouth twisted in mid-scream. Her candle was still burning beside her, but the flame leaned sharply away from her body, as if repelled. That was when the whispers turned to fear. The slaves said the baby's cry was not the voice of life. It was death itself, calling those who had tried to deny it. Even the animals seemed to sense it. Horses reared for no reason. Chickens laid blood-spotted eggs, and the hounds refused to go near the cabin where Eliza stayed. Every night the same pattern unfolded. Silence, then the softest of cries carried by the wind, and before dawn something would die. A bird falling from the rafters, a cow choking in its stall, or a man who simply did not wake up. Judge Vanu grew furious, insisting it was superstition poisoning their minds. But when one of his own house servants, an older man named Will, was found dead just outside the nursery window, even he began to lose his composure. Will had been seen earlier that evening, walking toward the quarters, saying he wanted to bring Eliza some food. When they found him the next morning, his tray was still in his hands, untouched. There wasn't a mark on him, but his expression was frozen in horror, and on his shirt was a single wet spot, like a tear that hadn't dried. Eleanor Vanu began to change after that. She grew pale and restless, unable to sleep, saying she could hear the babies cry even when no one else did. The sound followed her, she said, from room to room, soft at first, then louder as though it were inside the walls. One night she woke screaming, claiming she saw a small figure standing by the foot of her bed. When her husband rushed in, there was nothing there, but the smell of damp earth filled the air. The judge brought in another doctor, who blamed her nerves and prescribed rest, but rest never came. Within a week her hair had begun to gray, and dark circles sank beneath her eyes. She told the maid that the baby wanted something, that it was lonely, and that every time it cried, someone had to take its place in the silence. Then came the night of the storm, the only storm that year, and the one everyone remembered. Thunder cracked without rain, lightning flashed without clouds, and through it all, the sound of the crying rose louder than ever before. It came from everywhere, across the fields, from the well, from the empty nursery. The slaves huddled together in fear, praying through the noise. The judge locked himself in his study, clutching his pistol, while Eleanor sat in her rocking chair, whispering to the air as if speaking to a child only she could see. When morning came, the storm was gone, but another servant had died. This time it was one of the maids, found in the hallway outside Eleanor's room, her body limp, her skin cold as stone. On the wall beside her was a mark, a faint handprint, small like a baby's, pressed in what looked like soot. By then, no one doubted that something unholy was happening. The overseer, who had once dismissed the slaves' stories, packed his things and left without warning. The few who remained did only what they had to, keeping their distance from Eliza's cabin, crossing themselves every time they passed by. Eliza herself looked like a ghost of her former self, pale, thin, eyes red from sleepless nights. She still held her baby close, but those who dared glance at it said its chest barely moved, and its eyes never blinked. She spoke little, except to murmur strange things that made even the bravest shudder. "He doesn't like to be ignored," she once said. "He cries when people forget him." The judge tried to rid the plantation of the curse by sending Eliza and her baby away. He arranged for a trader to take them to another property, but the night before they were to leave, the trader was found dead in his wagon. His eyes were open, fixed on the sky, and his lips were blackened. The horses had torn free from their harnesses and vanished into the woods. That same night the crying returned, but this time it was louder than ever, echoing across every corner of the estate. The slaves covered their ears, Eleanor wept uncontrollably, and the judge fired his pistol into the dark, shouting for the noise to stop. But the moment he fired, silence fell, heavy and absolute. When morning came, they found the judge's horse dead in its stall, and every clock on the property had stopped at the same moment, just after midnight. The chain of deaths continued in the days that followed, each one stranger than the last. The plantation workers stopped counting after the 10th body. The cry came and went as it pleased, always bringing death in its wake. No one ever saw who or what was behind it. All they knew was that when that sound rose again, soft and hollow like a wind through the grave, someone would be gone by sunrise. The people no longer called it the baby's cry. They called it what it had become, the cry of death itself, a voice that reminded them that no one cheats the grave without paying the price. By the time the chain of deaths had torn through nearly everyone connected to the Varnu estate, the fear had turned into desperation. The baby's cry was now a part of the land itself. It didn't matter whether the sun was shining or the fields were full of workers, people still felt it, still heard it. That faint, mournful wail lingering in the air like a curse that refused to die. Judge Abram Varnu, now hollow-eyed and half-mad, finally admitted that the child's presence was something beyond his understanding. He summoned priests, doctors, even a traveling mystic who claimed to have banished spirits from dying towns. But no one could silence that sound. It came at its own will, soft at first, then sharp and heart-stopping, and always something followed it. A sickness, a death, or a shadow that slipped past the corner of one's eye. The judge's wife, Eleanor, had fallen into near hysteria. She refused to leave her room, saying that the baby's cry followed her even in her dreams. One night, she tore at her sheets and screamed that she could see the infant sitting by the window, watching her. The judge rushed in and found nothing but an open window and the smell of damp soil, as though something had come in from the earth itself. He locked her door from the outside after that, determined to protect her, or perhaps to protect himself from her madness. But he didn't know that the rest of the plantation was already unraveling. Eliza had stopped speaking altogether. Her body looked frail, her face sunken, but she never let go of the baby. The few slaves who remained said she barely ate, barely blinked, only sat in her cabin rocking the infant, whispering prayers that no one recognized. They begged her to let the priest bless the child, to end whatever had started that cursed night, but she refused. She said every attempt to bless him made him cry harder, and each time he cried, someone died. She believed that the only way to keep him calm was to keep him close, to sing him the songs she claimed came from the place he first returned from. Still, the deaths continued. The cries echoed. The slaves began to flee in the night, vanishing into the swamps despite the dangers that awaited them there. Some were caught by patrols, others were never seen again, and a few were found days later, drowned, their faces twisted in terror, their mouths open as though still screaming. The judge grew furious, calling it rebellion, but deep down he knew the truth. They weren't running from him. They were running from the sound. The cry had become like an unseen plague, poisoning the air, crawling through dreams. Then came the night of the attempted burial. It was Eleanor's idea, though her mind was breaking. She insisted that the only way to stop the horror was to bury the baby again, to return it to the ground it had been stolen from. "He wasn't meant to be here," she whispered to her husband. "You can't live on borrowed breath." The judge, desperate and half-drunk, agreed. They waited until late that night, when the storm clouds rolled in. Eliza was taken from her cabin, screaming, clutching the child to her chest. She fought like a woman possessed, biting and clawing at the men who held her. The baby did not cry, not once, but its grey eyes were open and fixed on the judge the entire time. They dug the grave near the edge of the field, the same spot where the stillborn had been meant to rest weeks earlier. Eleanor stood beside the hole, trembling, whispering prayers that dissolved into sobs. When they tried to take the baby from Eliza's arms, the wind began to howl, bending the trees backward though the air was heavy and still moments before. Thunder rolled in the distance, and somewhere across the plantation a door slammed hard enough to shake the earth. The judge forced the baby from Eliza's grasp and ordered his men to bury it quickly. She fell to her knees, screaming a single word again and again, "Don't," until her voice broke. The first shovel of dirt hit the small bundle, and the sound that followed was like nothing human. It wasn't a cry, not at first. It was a deep, shuddering breath drawn from the earth itself, as though the ground had begun to wake. Then the baby screamed, loud and sharp, piercing through the thunder, a sound that split the night open. Every man who stood there dropped their tools and fled. The judge stumbled backward, his heart pounding, as the storm seemed to erupt all at once. Lightning struck a nearby tree, setting it aflame, and rain began to pour so violently that it nearly drowned the sound. When it stopped minutes later, the grave was empty. The linen bundle was gone. Eliza was found hours later at the riverbank, unconscious, her arms wrapped around nothing. She kept whispering in her sleep, "He went home, over and over." But the next night the crying began again. This time it didn't sound distant. It came from beneath the house, from the very foundation of the big house itself. The walls seemed to shake with it, the windows rattling as if struck by invisible hands. Eleanor screamed until her voice was gone, clawing at the floorboards, insisting that the child was underneath her, trying to get out. When morning came, she was silent. The servants found her curled beside the nursery door, her skin pale and cold, her eyes open wide but seeing nothing. The judge ordered the entire floor torn up, but there was nothing beneath it, only cold dirt, damp and freshly disturbed. That same day he burned every piece of linen in the house, every crib, every toy, everything that might remind him of what he had seen. Yet even after the fires died, the sound lingered. At night, when the air was still and heavy, the faint echo of a baby's cry would drift through the halls. Softer now, almost a lullaby, as though the child was waiting. Some said it was trapped between worlds, forever reaching for the mother who had tried to keep it alive. Others said it was no longer a baby at all, but something else, something that fed on grief, on guilt, on the fragile line between life and death that the Vanu family had dared to cross. And for the rest of his days, Judge Vanu would wake in the middle of the night, clutching his chest, listening for that sound. Sometimes he heard nothing but silence. Other nights, just as he began to drift back to sleep, the faintest cry would rise again, soft, hollow, and full of rage. The disappearance of the child was not just an event. It was the moment when the entire plantation seemed to fall into a shadow that would never lift again. After weeks of strange deaths, sleepless nights, and whispers that spread like disease, everyone at the Vanu estate was living in a state of quiet madness. The infant who had defied death once had grown disturbingly silent. No one had seen the child for days. Some believed it had finally died for good. Others said it was taken by the midwife who had been there the night it first cried after being declared stillborn. But there were no tracks, no clues, no body, just a void that seemed to hum with unease. The mother, a young enslaved woman named Eliza, had gone nearly catatonic. Her eyes were hollow, Her lips cracked from prayer and grief, and her voice barely carried when she spoke. She would sit under the cypress tree near the quarters, rocking an empty bundle in her arms as though it still breathed. The other slaves avoided her, muttering that she was marked, that the child she bore was never meant for this world. Even the overseer refused to touch her. He said every man who had tried to take her back to work fell ill within a day. The master of the plantation, Judge Abram Varnu, grew desperate to end the superstition that had infected his land. He ordered every corner of the property searched. They tore through the slave cabins, overturned the barns, even drained the pond behind the smokehouse. Nothing. No infant, no cloth, no sign that the baby had ever existed beyond the feverish stories. But the search only made things worse. As soon as the pond water turned black with mud, a foul smell began to spread through the fields. Livestock died without cause. Workers claimed to see footprints, tiny, wet ones, appearing in the dirt at night near the main house. Some said they heard crying, faint and distant, sometimes from the forest, sometimes from beneath the floorboards of the nursery that had never been used. Judge Varnu's wife, Eleanor, who had been strong through the chaos, began to unravel. She said she could hear the baby calling her name at night, not in a human voice, but in something broken, stretched, unnatural. Servants found her in the nursery one morning, sitting by the cradle with her hair loose and eyes wide, humming a lullaby that no one recognized. When her husband tried to pull her away, she screamed that he was hurting the child. She refused to eat, refused to leave the room. The judge brought in a preacher, then a doctor, then an exorcist from Mobile, but nothing stopped her decline. On the 7th night after the baby's disappearance, Eleanor was found dead, still holding the cradle's edge, her lips frozen in a faint smile, as if she'd finally been allowed to sleep. The judge buried her behind the house, under a magnolia tree she had loved. But that same night, thunder rolled in, though the sky was clear. The slaves said it was the child calling again, angry that its mother had been taken before it. When lightning struck the magnolia 2 days later, splitting it in half, even the judge's most loyal men began to abandon the property. Some fled in the night, others begged to be sold off. Varnu himself refused to leave. He spent his nights in his study with bottles of whiskey and old law books, insisting he would not be haunted by superstitious nonsense. But as weeks passed, his sanity fractured. He began to write in a ledger, not about crops or finances, but about the thing that crawls in the walls and the breath of the grave. His handwriting grew erratic, almost childlike near the end. Months later, the plantation was nearly deserted. Travelers who passed by spoke of a rotting smell that hung over the place, and a sound like a baby crying from somewhere underground. The judge was last seen walking toward the family graveyard at dusk, holding something wrapped in cloth against his chest. No one followed him. The next morning the graveyard gate was open, and fresh dirt was scattered near Eleanor's grave. The judge was never seen again. When the few remaining servants dared to look inside the crypt, they found the judge's coat lying beside his wife's tomb, and a small handprint pressed into the stone. Over the decades that followed, the land changed hands many times. Each new owner tried to restore the estate, to bring life back to the fields. None stayed longer than a few years. Cattle would die, wells would sour, and every few seasons someone would report hearing a baby's cry echoing through the trees. In 1894, a fire burned down what was left of the main house. When townsfolk sifted through the ashes, they found something strange in the nursery's remains, a piece of charred fabric that looked like a baby's blanket, perfectly preserved beneath a layer of soot. Locals say that even now, when the air is thick and the night is still, you can hear it again, the same soft cry that started it all, rising from the earth as though it's calling for someone who never came back. Some call it a ghost. Some say it's the curse of a soul that was never supposed to be born. But the elders of the nearby town whisper something else entirely, that the baby didn't die, didn't vanish, but was taken by something older, something that walks between the living and the dead. And every generation or so, when a storm rolls through Alabama, someone claims to see footprints, small and wet, appearing in the dirt again, leading straight toward the ruins of the Vanu plantation, where the cry that brought death was first heard, and where it still waits unanswered.